let's talk about Angular. So Angular is a TypeScript-based open source web framework, right, that allows you to build single-page applications, very much like what we've been doing with React, right? They both follow the same idea of building components, where you build small reusable components that you can then combine to make more sophisticated ones, right, and build more complex, more behavioral complex components, entire pages, and then entire applications, right, with routing and communicating with third-party APIs, and dynamically rendering the content on the user interface, right? So it's the same idea. It uses the language TypeScript, excuse me, instead of JavaScript, and it's an extension of the JavaScript language that allows you to use modern concepts such as objects, interfaces, constructors. Allows you to do annotations like you would do in Java. You can do injection like auto-wired you would do in Java. So a lot of modern component-based concepts that have been very popular in the middle tier development environment for decades are now making their way into JavaScript and front-end development as well to deal with large complex applications. The Angular also enforces or implements several design patterns and architectural patterns that kind of force you to think of the application in following a particular structure, right? That it enforces the separation of concern between concerns of rendering content in HTML, whereas you would deal with state management, event handling in the JavaScript world, right? Whereas in React, it does not enforce that, right? In React, it's actually encouraged that you mix and match HTML mixed in with JavaScript, and you can have event handling and state management and rendering all inside of the same JavaScript, right? Whereas Angular discourages this, right? Where there's a very clear distinction between what is being used for rendering and what is being used for controlling the behavior, controlling the state management, access to the data, and whatnot. Okay? It also implements several other design patterns, certainly the model view controller, again, implementing a lot of the separation of concerns between how to control state management and event handling and rendering, but also other design patterns such as singleton pattern, factory, inversion of control. So many different design patterns are implemented and made very, very explicit in the framework. Whereas React.js is not as opinionated. Right? React.js lets you decide whether you want to implement these design patterns yourself or not. Whereas Angular is very, very adamant about following the structure. Perhaps that's why some developers felt that Angular was way too opinionated, a little bit too restrictive on forcing you to think about the application in a specific architecture, and felt a little more liked a little more the philosophy of React, where you're kind of a little more free to do whatever you want, right? As long as you have follow some conventions. Angular has a steeper learning curve than React. It's because it's just a larger framework. It has as opposed to in React, that you might have different libraries that you would use for different things, where you have routing, React DOM routing, where you do for routing, where you would do Redux for state management, and you would use different libraries to implement different things. Angular takes care of, provides abstractions for all these concepts, right, and has its own way of implementing these kinds of ideas, right? So it definitely has a much steeper learning curve, and that's why I kind of left it towards the end, so that since we're already coming from the React world, we already have learned a lot of the same concepts that we're going to need. We already know what a single-page application is. We already know what routing means. We already know what components are, and how to handle events, how to do state management. We know all these concepts, yes? And so my hope is that having understood all these concepts in React, you will find that they're applicable conceptually they're applicable also in Angular, right? And so I hope my hope is that you'll find that the learning curve is much shallower than would otherwise be, right? And I'll make an effort to point out what you have already learned in React and see how that maps into the Angular world, right? And oftentimes you find that it's just a syntactical difference, right? That this is how you do it in Angular, this is how you do it in React, and we'll see that it maps very well. So to get started, you'll need to install the command line interface, the Angular command line interface using npm. So yes, you do have to have Node.js already installed, which you do, since you've been using React all along. So you'll install this command line interface globally. -G installs it globally. This is the equivalent of installing create React app, right? This will install a command called ng for Angular. And this Angular command will allow you to create new boilerplate applications from scratch using ng new hello world. This will download a template application and it will copy it in a directory of the same name. You can then cd into that directory and you can run the boilerplate application using ngserve. ngserve uses in the back end, it uses just plain old npm start, and the --open will open up the browser for you, pointing directly of where it's being hosted. By default, the application runs at port 4200 as opposed to 3000 for React.js, right? So let's actually demo that. If we go to our command line and we go to our directory into CS4550. Right now we just have a React client application and a Java server application. Let's create a new Angular application. So we'll do ng new. And I'm going to follow the same naming convention that we've been using. So there's a WebDev SP200, 20, Genunzi. And this will be client. It's still a client application, but it's not a React application. It's going to be an Angular application, right? So that's going to take a bit. So it's asking me to do some configuration. So it's asking me, do you want me to install the routing library? I'm going to say yes. Yeah, I want the routing library. It's also asking me what kind of style sheet do I want to use. I want to use CSS. So while that's going, let's just talk about that a little bit. So it asks me which routing, if I want the routing library. It says yes, right? So that's the equivalent of installing the React router DOM, right? Which in React, it doesn't come with React, right? You need to install it separately. Over here, it asks me, do I want to install it? So that's one of several libraries or Angular libraries that don't come installed by default with the Angular core library. There's several other libraries that don't come installed. You need to install it separately. Like for instance, dealing with forms, dealing with input fields, drop downs, and whatnot. That's not installed by default. You need to import that separately. Yeah, so it's downloading. If you you'll notice here that instead of JavaScript files, we'll be working with TS files, which is the extension for the TypeScript files, right? So TypeScript files are mostly JavaScript. Well, actually, no, they are JavaScript. It's a superset of JavaScript, right? Which adds capabilities of declaring variables that have a particular data type. So you can now enforce variables to be numbers or strings or date or Boolean, right? With all the good practice of doing a lot of validation at development time instead of at runtime, right? All right, so it created it. If you look at now the content here, notice that now we have an Angular application in there. We can navigate in there, client Angular. And in here, we can run this by saying ngserve open. So this kicks off the server and will open up the browser pointing to, use port. Looks like I already have something running there. Let me stop that. Let's try it again. All right, it's compiling, meaning it's translating all the TypeScript files into low-level JavaScript, right? So that it can run on any browser, right? As opposed to TypeScript, instead of using high-level JavaScript, which few browsers will understand. Right, so it's building it, transpiling it down. This is the same thing. This is the same process that React does, right? Because in React we use ES6 that needs to be compiled down to JavaScript, which is more common to all browsers. So there it is. So this is the default boilerplate application that we get in the template application. And then the intention is for us to replace this application with our own content, right? So let's see how we could do that.